The BDS movement is entirely performative. Let me be clear right up front. This is not a Hasbara post about how awesome Israel is. That would be lame. Israel does not need me standing here yelling, but look at our medical technology. Nobody came here for a TED talk from a short, balding, middle aged man with a fantastic gray beard. This is not about proving Jews are useful. That framing is already insulting. Jews do not earn dignity by inventing things. Israel does not earn legitimacy by being impressive. A people's right to live freely in their ancestral homeland is not conditional on startup exits, drip irrigation, Nobel Prizes, cybersecurity, cherry tomatoes, or whether your phone accidentally relies on something developed in Tel Aviv. No, this post is for the haters, for the people who pretend their selective obsession with the Jewish state is moral clarity, for the activists who call boycotting Israel justice while doing absolutely nothing to improve Palestinian life, for the professional outrage merchants who think harassing Jews is a personality. This is not a love letter to Israel. It is a mirror held up to the people who hate her. And spoiler alert, the lighting is not flattering. There is a special kind of person who boycotts Israel from an iPhone. Not because the iPhone is Israeli, it is not. Relax. Apple's lawyers can put down the falafel, but because the modern world is stitched together with global supply chains, cybersecurity, medical research, agriculture, software, chips, pharmaceuticals, emergency response tools, and enough invisible infrastructure to make moral purity collapse on contact. And still, there they are, posting boycott Israel on platforms protected by cybersecurity tools, sharing graphics on laptops running through global systems Israel helps power, using navigation apps, cloud services, messaging platforms, medical devices, and research tools touched in some way by the very country they claim to have surgically removed from their lives. It is not activism. It is cosplay with a kufiya filter. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS, presents itself as a noble human rights campaign. Its official call began in 2005 and urges boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel until Israel meets the movement's demands. Sounds clean, right? That is always how bad ideas introduce themselves. Nicely dressed, good font, moral language, maybe a Dove logo, very professional, like a timeshare presentation for resentment. But beneath the slogans is something far less noble, because BDS does not merely criticize Israeli policy. Criticizing Israeli policy is legitimate. Israelis criticize Israeli policy before breakfast, during lunch, after dinner, and while aggressively explaining why everyone else is wrong. It is practically the national cardio. You can criticize settlements, you can criticize governments, you can criticize military decisions, politicians, religious parties, court reforms, coalition chaos, and the price of parking in Tel Aviv. That is not anti Semitism. But BDS does something different. It singles out the one Jewish state for elimination from polite society. Not reform, not negotiation, not peace. Isolation, erasure, cultural quarantine, academic exile, economic punishment dressed up as virtue, and then it calls itself justice. No, please. The great joke of BDS is that almost no one practicing it actually practices it. They do not boycott Israel, they boycott symbols. They boycott a hummus brand when someone on TikTok tells them to. They boycott a singer who performs in Tel Aviv. They boycott a professor, a film festival, a university exchange, a Jewish artist, a Jewish business, or, when they are feeling especially brave, a Starbucks cup that had absolutely nothing to do with Israel, but had the misfortune of being photographed near a bad opinion. This is not a strategy. This is emotional laundering. It allows people to take a complicated conflict, remove all history, ignore all Jewish indigeneity, erase Palestinian leadership failures, skip over Hamas unless they can blame Israel for Hamas existing, and then land on the simplest possible conclusion: the Jews are the problem. But they do not say Jews, they say Zionists. Very sophisticated, very graduate seminar. Same old wine, new anti Semitic bottle. That is the trick of anti Zionism. It gives ancient hatred a modern passport. BDS activists love to declare that they are standing against oppression. Wonderful. Then, where are the global boycotts of China, Iran, Russia, Turkey, Syria, Qatar, Venezuela, North Korea? Where are the campus encampments demanding sanctions against regimes that jail dissidents, murder women for showing hair, execute gay people, crush minorities, censor speech, disappear journalists, and treat human rights like a suggestion box in a burning building, the moral microscope always finds the Jew. Amazing how that works. And that is what makes BDS so revealing. It is not built around consistent principles, it is built around selective outrage. If BDS were truly about human rights, it would have a universal standard. It would confront every regime with equal intensity. It would condemn Hamas without needing a committee meeting. It would demand the release of hostages without footnotes. It would care about Palestinians when they are oppressed by Palestinian leaders, used as human shields by terrorists, robbed of aid by armed gangs, or sacrificed by regimes that find dead Palestinians more useful than living ones. And yes, Palestinian civilians have suffered terribly. That is exactly what makes the performance so grotesque. Because anti Zionists do not treat Palestinian suffering as a human tragedy to be solved. They treat it as a prop, a costume, a bloody backdrop for their own moral theater. If they actually cared about Palestinians, they would be furious at Hamas for stealing aid, building tunnels under civilians, turning neighborhoods into battlefields, and sacrificing their own people for international sympathy. If they actually cared about Palestinians, they would demand better leadership, honest education, economic development, civil rights, peace, coexistence, and a future not built around eternal war with Jews. But they do not. They use Palestinian pain the way a bad politician uses a baby at a campaign rally. Hold it up, pose for the cameras, put it down when the speech is over. BDS does not build Palestinian life, it performs Palestinian solidarity. There is a difference. One builds schools, jobs, peace initiatives, trade, cooperation, and civil society. The other screams at a Jewish musician until she cancels a concert. Mazel tov, Che Guevara, you saved humanity by harassing a violinist. The movement also misunderstands the country it claims to punish. Israel is not some tiny orange stand at the edge of the desert, waiting nervously for a student government resolution to approve its right to exist. Israel is a high tech, medically advanced, militarily capable, culturally alive, stubborn, argumentative, infuriatingly resilient nation. That is not Hasbara. That is the part that makes the boycott so ridiculous. And yes, before someone writes me an angry email from a laptop made possible by global capitalism, BDS has had some minor successes. Some artists have canceled shows. Some academic groups have passed resolutions. Some companies have dealt with pressure campaigns. Some universities have entertained divestment theater because apparently nothing says serious scholarship like a committee of 19-year-olds discovering geopolitics between sociology class and coffee. Fine. A few trophies for the mantle. But if the goal was to cripple Israel, isolate Israel, or make Israel economically radioactive, the results are not exactly Churchillian. In 2000, Israel's GDP was roughly $132 billion. By 2024, according to World Bank data, it had reached roughly $540 billion. Israel's GDP per capita reached about 54,177 in 2024. That is not collapse, that is growth on steroids. The markets tell the same story. The Tel Aviv Stock Exchange tracks the TA125, Israel's broad stock index. By May 29th, 2026, Trading Economics reported the TA125 around 4,430 points, and up more than 60% from the same time the previous year. So, yes, BDS can occasionally bully a singer, pressure a student government, or make a coffee chain issue a statement drafted by 12 lawyers and one exhausted intern. But the Jewish state did not vanish, it grew. Its economy expanded, its markets climbed, its tech sector remained a global engine. Israel's own innovation authority reported in 2025 that high tech output had held steady at about 17% of GDP. Reuters reported that Israeli high tech companies raised $15.6 billion in private funding in 2025, and that the sector represented about 20% of GDP, 15% of jobs, and more than half of exports. That is the real punchline. BDS keeps trying to boycott Israel out of existence. Israel keeps replying with quarterly results. They want to isolate Israel from the world, but the world is already tangled up with Israel. Medicine, water technology, emergency response, cybersecurity, agriculture, defense systems, artificial intelligence, chips, apps, research, universities, scientific partnerships, venture capital, and innovation networks do not come in neat little ideological packages. You cannot remove Israel from the modern world with a chant. You cannot uninstall Jewish history like an app. And you definitely cannot boycott Israel while your activism depends on the very global systems Israel helps protect and improve. But again, this was never really about practical impact. It was about the show. Posting the right graphic, standing in the right crowd, using the right words, performing the right outrage, making sure everyone sees you being a good person in public. The performative nature becomes even clearer when boycotts target companies based on rumor, vibes, or guilt by association. One person posts a claim, someone else turns it into an infographic. A third person screams, genocide supporter, at a teenager making minimum wage behind a counter. And suddenly, a bagel shop in Brooklyn becomes the front line of the Middle East conflict. Congratulations, General Maki Otto. Nothing says liberation like berating a barista who just wants to know whether you want oat milk. This is what happens when moral clarity is replaced by viral certainty. Someone posts a graphic, someone else shares it, a third person performs outrage for the algorithm. Everyone goes home feeling righteous. Meanwhile, nothing gets built. No Palestinian child is freer, no Israeli child is safer, no hostage comes home, no peace agreement is signed, no corrupt leader is held accountable, no terrorist group is disarmed, no Arab and Jew sit together and say, how do we make tomorrow less bloody than yesterday? Just noise. BDS is the politics of the empty chair. It refuses dialogue, then complains there is no peace. It boycotts coexistence programs, then claims coexistence is impossible. It punishes Israeli academics, including the very Israelis most likely to criticize their own government. It silences artists, cancels cultural exchange, attacks Jewish institutions, and then insists it is only opposing a state, not a people. Please, we have seen this movie before. The Jew is always told the boycott is temporary, just until we behave, just until we become acceptable, just until we stop being too visible, too successful, too particular, too national, too stubborn, too Jewish. But Jewish history teaches us something important. When people say, we only hate the collective Jew, believe them exactly as much as you would believe someone who says, I only hate your family, not you personally. Zionism is the Jewish people's right to self determination in our ancestral homeland. You do not have to like every Israeli policy to understand that this right is not up for a public referendum run by people who learned Middle East history from a carousel post. BDS pretends to be pressure. It is performance. It pretends to be peace. It is punishment. It pretends to be moral courage. It is conformity dressed as rebellion. Real courage is harder. Real courage means telling Palestinians the truth about failed leaders and terrorist exploiters. Real courage means telling Israelis the truth when they get things wrong, without denying their right to exist. Real courage means admitting that Jews are not visitors in Israel. We are not colonial guests at our own archaeological sites. Hebrew was not invented by birthright. Jerusalem is not a rumor. The Jewish story did not begin in 1948, and Jewish sovereignty is not a crime because it survived. So boycott all you want. Boycott oranges, boycott hummus, boycott concerts, boycott imaginary Starbucks policy, boycott Israeli academics who probably agree with you on half the issues, but committed the unforgivable sin of being born Jewish in the wrong zip code. But do not call it justice. Call it what it is, a performance for people who want the feeling of morality without the burden of truth. Jews have been reading the fine print for 3,000 years. We know the difference. If you enjoy my writing, support me by buying my book, Screaming into the Void, available on paperback or Kindle on Amazon.com.